I am going to be speaking about the spiritual testament of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, whose funeral will be celebrated in the morning, tomorrow morning, Thursday morning at 9:30 in St. Peter's Square in Rome. The Pope died on December 31st, the last day of last year. Each Pope writes a spiritual testament long before he dies, and then the Vatican releases that just after they die. So on December 31st in the afternoon, the Holy See released the spiritual testament of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, which had been written 16 years ago, dated August 29th, 2006, when he had been Pope for yet less than a year and a half. So it's a spiritual testament from the time when he was still relatively young, although he was in his late 70s. He just passed away at the age of 95. My spiritual testament, he writes, when at this late hour of my life I look back on the decades I have wandered through, I see, first of all, how much reason I have to give thanks. So his testament starts with his gratitude. And first of all, he writes, above all, I thank God himself, the giver of all good gifts, who has given me life and guided me through all kinds of confusion. And we might imagine there, as all of us, there were moments of confusion in his life. He grew up in Nazi Germany, and he was impressed into the German army when he was 15 years old. And the confusion, his father was very much opposed to the Nazi regime. And his father was a police officer and lost a couple of his jobs, and they had to move to different cities because of that opposition. So he writes, in the midst of his thanks, that he was guided through all kinds of confusion. He continues, who has always picked me up when I began to slip, who has always given me anew the light of his countenance. In retrospect, Benedict writes, I see and understand that even the dark and arduous stretches of this path were for my salvation, and that he guided me well in those very stretches. So this first paragraph of his testament is thanking God even for the difficulties, even for the confusions, because as he looks back, he sees that in the end deepened and strengthened him in his faith and in his personality. He turns immediately to his parents. I thank my parents who gave me life in difficult times. So that was in 1927, time of depression, time of great confusion in Germany, and prepared a wonderful home for me with their love, which shines through all my days as a bright light until today. So he's thinking back on his childhood and on his parents as he writes his spiritual testament, and he's deeply grateful. He grew up in a little town on the River Inn, and I visited there, and there are pictures of their childhood together. A little museum is there today, and it's a beautiful, peaceful, quiet, tiny town, Marktel am Inn, Marktel on the River Inn, and I think he was very happy there. My father's clear-sighted faith taught us brothers and sisters to believe and stood firm as a guide in the midst of all my scientific knowledge. And that reminds me that when I spoke with him once in an interview in the 1990s, he told me that perhaps the greatest single influence on him was his father. His father, and he repeats that in this testament. My father's clear-sighted faith taught us brothers and sisters to believe and stood firm as a guide in the midst of all my scientific knowledge. So he's distinguishing between what he learned as a student and a scholar and a theologian with what his father taught him when he was a child. Quite a significant contrast, that his father's clear-sighted faith stood firm as a guide in the midst of all my scientific knowledge. And then he turns, of course, to his mother. My mother's heartfelt piety and great kindness remain a legacy for which I cannot thank her enough. He continues, my sister, her name was Maria, my sister has served me selflessly and full of kind concern for decades. What he means is that his sister never married. She was the firstborn in the family, the older sister. She took care of him when he was a little boy, kind of led him around, as sisters do. She actually came and lived with him in Rome and was his housekeeper when he was one of the top cardinals in the church. So he recalls her in this legacy. When she died in the 1990s, he was devastated and deeply, deeply sorrowful. So he writes about her, and then he says, my brother has always paved the way for me with the clear-sightedness of his judgments, with his powerful determination, and with the cheerfulness of his heart. Without this ever new going ahead and going along, I would not have been able to find the road. What he doesn't mention here, what's interesting, his brother, older by 2 years, Georg Ratzinger, became a priest as well. And the two of them became priests on the same day, June 29th, 1951. He was 2 years younger than his brother, but the two of them and one other friend all were ordained Catholic priests on the same day. And his older brother went on to be very much a musician and ran a choir in Regensburg. And Joseph Ratzinger appreciated his older brother very much. He continues, I thank God from the bottom of my heart for the many friends, men and women, whom he has always placed at my side, for the co-workers at all stages of my path, for the teachers and students he has given me, because Joseph Ratzinger was for many years a very much loved professor in German universities before he was named a bishop by Paul VI and then called to Rome by John Paul II in 1981. And then he never again left Rome for the last 40 years of his life. He continues, I gratefully entrust them all to his goodness, and I would like to thank the Lord for my beautiful home in the Bavarian foothills of the Alps, in which I was able to see the splendor of the Creator himself shining through time and again. This is his memory of his childhood, of the beauty of nature, of the Alps, the foothills of the Alps in Bavaria, which are splendid and have the seasons, the snow and the spring and the autumn. And this is what he recalls as he writes his testament. I thank the people of my homeland for allowing me to experience the beauty of faith time and again, because the life in the 1920s and 1930s in Germany was still very traditional, with Sunday Mass. Almost everyone in the village would have attended Mass, and they would have sung together, also their faith, and that he remarks here in a touching way about the country of faith. And I ask you, dear compatriots, not to let your faith be distracted. So he's calling on the Germans to remain Christian. Finally, I thank God for all the beauty I was able to experience during the various stages of my journey, but especially in Rome and in Italy, which has become my second home. So there you have the family, the years in Germany, and then he's transitioning to the years when he became world famous, when he lived in Rome and in Italy, his second home. And here is the center of the testament. I ask for forgiveness from the bottom of my heart from all those whom I have wronged in some way. What I said earlier of my compatriots, he continues, meaning the Germans, I now say to all who were entrusted to my service in the church, stand firm in the faith, he says. Do not be confused. Often it seems as if science, on the one hand, the natural sciences, on the other, historical research, especially the exegesis of the Holy Scriptures, has irrefutable insights to offer that are contrary to the Catholic faith. So what he is saying here is the confrontation between faith and reason. And if there's one confrontation in his mind and his heart, in his life, it's that confrontation, that it seems that science and historical research contradict the faith. So that's why people say we can't believe these things anymore. They're against science. He doesn't believe that. He thinks they can be reconciled. He thinks the faith can stand, but he recognizes the strength of the challenge, and he puts it right at the center of his testament. And he says, I have witnessed from times long past the changes in natural science and have seen how apparent certainties against the faith vanished, proving themselves not to be science, but philosophical interpretations only apparently belonging to science. Just as, moreover, it is in dialogue with the natural sciences that faith has learned to understand the limits of the scope of its affirmations, and thus its own specificity. So here in his final testament, he's speaking so much like a professor in a certain way, but it's moving because it was the great intellectual battle of his life, and it was a battle where the claims of science, which are strong, because if someone proves by apparent scientific proof that something is true, we nod our heads because we are reasonable and we have to accept what the evidence seems to be saying. But he's reminding us here that often that the from times long past, the changes in natural science, and have seen how apparent certainties against the faith vanished. So he's giving us a glimpse of the central intellectual battle of his life. And he continues, for 60 years now, I have accompanied the path of theology, especially biblical studies, and I've seen seemingly unshakable theses collapse with the changing generations, which turned out to be mere hypotheses. Then he says something very interesting. He gives his final summary of this. This is almost the end. I have seen and see how, out of the tangle of hypotheses, the reasonableness of faith has emerged and is emerging anew. So he sees something good coming out of this long, many decades of battle, which was really his battle, an intellectual battle over truth against exaggerated claims of science and of scriptural scholars, often turning out not to be as true as they are first presented to be. But he says, out of the tangle of hypothesis, the reasonableness of faith has emerged and is emerging anew. So for him, reason, which is connected to the word logos, which the Greek language uses for word, but also means reason or meaning. So when we say in the beginning was the Word in the Gospel of John, we also could say in the beginning was the reason. And he says the reasonableness of faith has emerged and is emerging anew. So he's hopeful and he's sort of thankful even for these battles. And here's his final sentence. Jesus Christ is truly the way, the truth, and the life. And the church, in all her shortcomings, is truly his body. That's how he summarizes the work of his life and the fact that he was a priest, a bishop, a cardinal, and finally Pope and Emeritus Pope, involved always with the life of the church. He reaffirms his faith. And then he gives two final sentences. Finally, I humbly ask, pray for me, so that the Lord may admit me to the eternal dwellings, despite all my sins and shortcomings. For all those entrusted to me, my heartfelt prayer goes out day after day. And then it's signed Benedict XVI, Supreme Pontiff. That's the final testament of Pope Benedict as released on Saturday. It ends with prayer. It begins with gratitude. It ends with heartfelt prayer going out day after day for all those entrusted to him. And that means everyone in the church and, in a sense, everyone in the world. That's how Benedict thought of his life, and that is how he ended his life, with daily prayer for everyone.